G'day, welcome to Aimless Ramblings. I'm here with Simon and Tim, and today's topic is, broadly speaking, maps. It came out of a quote which I found that linked quite nicely into our previous topic, which I think you know, Tim.
Yes, so the quote actually comes from a guy named Alfred Korzybinski from Science and Vanity, and it goes along the lines of, a map is not the territory it represents, but, if correct, it has a similar structure to the territory, which accounts for its usefulness.
And I thought that tied in really nicely with our previous topic of labels, like a map, obviously full of labels and only vaguely actually represents the reality. So, and that's where we're at. So I'm just going to have a bit of a talk about maps in general, small bit on the history of maps, and their roles in the formation of the world that we know it. So ye olde maps, arguments are about on what map is actually the oldest map, because when you go to a Neolithic stone carving, how do you know it's not just abstract lines? So there's a couple which we're interpreting them as maps. They may not be maps, but 4,000 years BC type thing, carved into rock faces, they think displaying agricultural plots. So quite old. You move through to Ptolemy's maps, which are probably some of the first maps that we'd recognize today of the world, and it's actually quite a useful map, pretty good looking. And a lot of the rest of the world just did star maps because there's no, how do I put this succinctly? It takes quite a lot of mental prowess to be able to conceive what something looks like from above. For us it's very easy because GPS, we have that image. But to have not had that image, most old maps before the Romans were either of the skies or just from a vantage point, so a very, very localized map. But something that came out of that is a couple of things I was reading is the sense of a nation couldn't really exist because you didn't have this cohesive border structure, the borders between two Germanic tribes' lands weren't actually set out. If there's a river, maybe this side of the river is mine, that side of the river is yours. But where there's no geographical structure, there's no actual markation. So a house there, you go, well, I don't actually know what nation I belong to. So you move on to, in terms of the history of maps, the medieval and eventually the Renaissance period, and that's where really maps as a nation state really started to become prominent. You've got the Treaty of the Westphalian Treaty, I think, which essentially ends the wars of religion in Europe, and that kind of concretes your idea of a nation state. And most of those discussions were regarding maps, regarding the boundaries, the borders, and so forth. So we very neatly divide the world up into abstract little parcels, and it allows us to coexist side by side by saying, I'm in my little coloured square, you're in your little coloured square. Yeah, quite a ramble, reasonably aimless. I think it's fitting.
Yep.
Was it Tim next?
Well, yeah, I was actually just going to comment on that. So I think that you've really summarized quite neatly in some ways how maps, both from a economic perspective and from a political power perspective, are important. Because one of the first maps we're talking about there is the division of land, right? So being able to actually divide up land from a possession perspective and from the economic outputs and the linkage of that to family groupings or taxation or whatever is one of the key factors in actually sort of driving economic production and taxation beyond that sort of family unit level. And then as well, I think we've touched on really the importance of maps and power and claimed, and I think this is one of the great it's an interesting thing about a map. A map is kind of like a heuristic. So, especially post-Westphalian, when we see a map and we see that a country goes all the way up to a borderline, we think that all of the intangible institutions of that state, its laws, its customs, its influence and power, run all the way up to that borderland, and then in some cases just stop and don't go on beyond that. Whereas historically speaking, like a really great example of sort of a counterpoint to this is James Scott's A History of The Art of Not Being Governed, an anarchist history of upland Southeast Asia, where he talks about how you'd have a political entity which would make this sort of grandiose claim to controlling an entire river delta area, but realistically the power would wane the further you get from the capital. So it's sort of like that idea of a smooth rather than a clear-cut delineation of a map. So do you think in some ways maybe a map is also like a claim of power and a claim of legitimacy?
Definitely like the post-Westphalian ones. Definitely. Like before then, it tended to be like you lay claim, but you only control what you can physically control. Because I guess as I was trying to get to, like, without the structure of a map, you can't really get the bureaucracy almost of a nation state functioning well enough to properly enforce those concepts. And, you know, so you go to one of your people in the upland, Southeast Asia, right? To them, say, I assume Vietnam is included in that, yeah?
Yeah, well, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, all those areas there.
Yeah. So, like, someone, say, farmer, uplands, Cambodia, they don't necessarily think of themselves as Cambodian, right? So the map of Cambodia doesn't necessarily mean much to them. But once you can have them buying into, I guess, the concept of this map means I am Cambodian, means I am within this nation state, therefore I'm, by acceptance, I guess, under its influence. Yeah.
So it's like a tool of acculturation as well as a claim.
Well, that's a very fancy way of saying it, yeah.
Simon, do you have anything?
In relation to a lot of what you were speaking about, it's really interesting seeing that kind of how a physical object has a very social aspect. And it's that, like, sort of drawing that, quite literally, ironically, drawing that line to work out what is what and where is how. But yeah, actually, in relation to what you were talking about and in maps, a lot of, over time, maps in its entirety haven't actually been entirely useful in every situation. So, for example, if you ask, some guy who's going hiking about a topographic map, he might be like, don't really need a topographic map. I need a map to know where the rest stops are. And where that comes to the forefront was during, I'll bring up the date, it was like 1920s. Britain decided that it wanted to make all its underground connect up with each other. So what they were doing was they were using all the landmarks near each other, going, yeah, cool. But it was this weird sprawling mess of, like, spaghetti, because they were all everywhere and doing whatever they wanted, and some of them weren't even on the map because they were so far out. And what happened was a famous graphic designer, Harry Beck, who is a English technical draftsman, which is a type of engineer. And what he did was he just went, nobody actually really cares what they're driving past when they're in the tube, because you're in the tube and it's dark. So as long as we have vague ideas which stop you want to get off at to get to where, we're all happy. So he just redesigned what a subway map looks like, because he's like, well, we don't need to say that this is 20 miles away and this is 10 miles away. We just need to say, this is one stop, this is the next stop. And then that sort of smoothed out this sort of what we nowadays see as just a normal train map. It sort of just made this sort of construct. And they disguised it as like sort of a diagram more than a map. But yeah, I just generally found that was like a interesting step where maps, everybody thinks of, in a particular way. Sam, you had something you wanted to say?
Yeah, just like, it's a super interesting topic there, because it's the map evolving from attempting to represent a direct reality to, we all know this doesn't represent reality, but we're actually perfectly fine with it. It's just super interesting. You know, we go, cool. I know that's not remotely what it actually looks like, but she's all good. Real interesting. Sorry, keep going.
Yeah. That is most of my entire thing.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's really interesting
Pretty
seeing
cool.
how it like sort of rolled out across a lot of places, because there's a lot of places with a lot of train systems, and a lot of time it's like, yes, you stop in particular spots, but you don't really need to know that you go past the church halfway across, you know, your track, because you're not going to be able to get off where the church is. So it's like, and he also brought in the whole idea of color coordinating and making like a key for particular like stations and whatnot, where prior to that it was just like, this station's for Surrey, this station's for somewhere. Tim, you had something you want to say?
Yeah, so I was going to follow on from what both you and Sam have said and say that it's interesting to see abstraction in the map sets. And so, really, previously what Sam was talking about was maps as a form of depiction, and then I was like, well, if they're depicting national territories, then they're maybe a function of power. But here, I think really you're drawing out the idea of the map as technology. Like, so the map is a tool which you use, and therefore you craft the tool to achieve the best outcome that is required. Do you think in that case, we've already talked about how every map is potentially a statement of political power, that we can potentially shape maps within our own societies to achieve not just political outcomes, but maybe social justice outcomes?
I definitely do. It's just interesting where maps pop up. Like, for example, just for all the places that you can drop off books, so there's a lot of book swaps, and there's a map used to just find those particular things, and it's just like little landmarks used. But I think Sam had something he wanted to say.
Yeah, it just came to my mind then. It's a so I don't know if anyone's ever watched The West Wing. Reasonably entertaining show. There's a great scene in it. I think they are the Cartographers Society for Equality or some such, and essentially they want the president to change away from the Mercator projection to a different projection, because they say that the Mercator projection, which distorts the size of countries, leads to us valuing them less. You know, so we see America or Europe far larger than it is in reality on that projection, whereas classically poorer third world countries are far smaller by virtue of being nearer to the equator. So,
yeah, well, the global south and Africa in particular are underrepresented.
Yeah, exactly. You know, so it's quite interesting. It just ties in there, you know.
Well, there is a lot of literature out there, I think even you were discussing this, where post-colonial theorists equate maps with a mechanism of oppression. But I would also say that when people who are not necessarily under the control of some sort of colonial overlord also have the ability to utilize maps as a form of oppression. So I don't think there's any particularly European or American about it. Simon?
Yeah, weirdly, when you were talking about like maps and how it's used for oppression, the two best examples I can think of where maps have used to repress and whatnot would have to be post-World War I and post-World War II, when they carved up the opponent countries, saying, oh, well, this is part of this now, and like divided up countries as they saw fit. And by mapping that, they gained power from it.
In terms of sort of the victor goes the spoils. I suppose another question that I would have to ask when it comes to mapping, and it might seem like it's a little bit of a jump, and it's more towards Simon's speciality because we're talking about technology in maps, so, and also oppression in maps, is that one of the mechanisms by which through scientific racism non-white peoples, particularly Africans, were denigrated was through the science or the pseudoscience of phrenology. So like mapping people's skulls and then attempting to kind of map behavioral patterns to the shape and size of their skulls. Simon, would you have anything to say on that, as like how a map can be used as a mechanism of control, or even like how a map can falsely distort reality?
As long as pseudoscience exists, and you can find something to mean something else, and you can get at least two random people to go, yeah, I agree with that, mapping is going to be a danger. The best example we're running into the issue with in Australia is there's a lot of what was popular at the time to call places, but now is somewhat racist in their naming, just because they thought it was appropriate at the time to call this N-word hill, and it's not really appropriate in the current day and age, but it's like, that's what it's labeled. So you have to go through the whole effort of the community going, okay, we need to change that name, and, you know, there's always those people that hate change, and you're like, but this is quite horrific. And back to phrenology, it's this whole entire thing of, like, you take two different approaches when you go to a scientific approach. So you obviously have the one side, which is they want to seek answers, and the other one is they want to find answers. And if you seek answers, you might not find your answers, but you'll have a lot of, you know, you'd help people to not fall down the wrong paths to find the wrong things. But if you're seeking answers, you'll just go, okay, well, this and this happens, it's got a correlation, but doesn't equal causation, but we're going to say it equals causation because it's correlated. It's like the good old shark and ice cream analogy, that, you know, if you eat ice cream, you get attacked by sharks. They don't remember that both those are during the summer. It's like, yeah. And I feel like that happens.
Ice cream attracts sharks.
Ice cream may potentially attract sharks, Sam. I'm sure you can get a peer-reviewed study put together to try and figure it out.
Yeah, or at least I'll get funding.
I was actually going to jump in because we've now sort of started to talk a little bit about one of the things I wanted to discuss, which is kind of the fuzziness and at the same time the hardness of lines in ethnic maps. And what I mean is the sort of socially constructed and defined groupings that separate out into humanity. One of the best ones that I can talk about, which is probably the easiest one and probably one of the most people will be familiar with, is the fungibility of the term white and whiteness. So particularly when you're talking about the New World and the immigrants to the New World, when you have the initial immigration of mainly Anglosphere individuals, so Welsh, Scots, Irish, and English into these countries, such as the Americas and New Zealand and Australia, there is these hard lines between, the Englishman and the Scot, and never shall their children marry, and they go to different churches and they go to different pubs, and there's that one of the big reasons why you have two different pubs in a lot of small country towns in Australia. Goes back to that divide between the Catholic and the Protestants who wouldn't share the same drinking hole. And it's interesting because over time, obviously, particularly when exposed to the other in that sort of bracketed sense of immigrants from whether it initially be Central Europe, and then it came from Southern Europe, and then now with people coming from Africa, from the Middle East, from Latin America to Australia, the term white has expanded in each successive generation of immigration. So nowadays you have people who, in the 70s and the 80s were denigrated as, being people of Southern European extraction, pretty uncontroversially, depending once again on who you're talking to and whereabouts, are seen as part of the white majority. And it's interesting as well that it's not just an external acceptance by the groups, like the dominant group, but these people have very much internalized their position. We've seen the increasing attraction of nativist and xenophobic political parties amongst ethnic minority, former ethnic minority groups, which have been incorporated to the overarching Australian or American attitude. And so, in this sense, what I was going to ask really for you guys is how useful do you think that mapping out on ethnic terms, which I suppose in some ways you could argue, and this can be somewhat controversial, that there is a little bit of a cult of ethnicity at the moment where people are Ancestry.com and tracing back to their 30th ancestor, and I'm 2% gypsy or whatever, trying to define who they are on the basis of what extraction they come from. How much of that do you think leads to both internal mapping of oneself to sort of angst in oneself, but also in terms of angst in a society as people both form and then deform these sort of lines of ethnic sort of meaning. Simon?
Yeah, so in relation to your question about this whole, like, mapping of ethnicity and then the people seek out, like, you know, to find out what thing is, I feel like it's sort of this, I'm trying to find a better word, but it's almost a fetishization of other. It's this whole entire thing of, it's no longer a thing to fear, but it's something that's new and exciting. So if I'm new and exciting and pretend to be new and exciting without all, you know, the persecution from being new and exciting, then yay! And that's pretty much what I feel like this whole entire modern movement towards tracing it back, you know, 20,000 generations to find out that, you know, some guy was on a sailor ship one time and was from some country, and they're like, oh wow, I'm diverse. And that's generally what I get. Sam, you have something you want to say?
I would probably say it could just be people strongly desire to know where they are from so they can have a personal historical narrative. Like, it's like, say, you look at Germanic European cultures where, or even I think Indic cultures, they quite often have your family names are part of your name. So, you know, my father, my grandfather, my grandfather. So you have this sense of, this is my personal history. I don't know my grandparents' parents' names. So I think it could be that we, in a lot of Western culture, no longer have this incredibly long knowledge of our history. I guess because, you know, if you're not an Aboriginal Australian and you live in Australia, you're a migrant. So it could be, you know, we have lost that initial history, and this could just be a seeking of history. You know, I don't think a lot of Aboriginal Australians, for instance, are probably terribly concerned at what portion, you know, Gypsy they might be, because they have a history they can tie into.
I was going to say, do you think as well, though, that could potentially be an outgrowth of the fact that as modern Australia and other Western cultures have developed, that the traditional coercive, one could say, narratives that have sort of defined those cultures, like of being a Christian, white British nation, you know, established on the terra nullius, you know, all those fictions which have been undermined through progressive changes through the 1960s and onwards, that without, for people that are part of those dominant groups, they now essentially feel like what was their sort of rock base that they were standing on has turned out to be sand, and they're now sort of clawing out, trying to find, you know, something else to grab onto.
I doubt it, because I know, so my wife's Austrian, quite a few people in Austria that I know of have traced their histories as well. And, you know, they may be 12 generations within a 100 square mile circle, but they still have that desire to know where they came from. I think we have a very big tendency to ascribe human phenomenon to unique to us or our environment, where actually it's just people like knowing where they come from. We have the capabilities, you know, to look at our genetic composition. Now we go, cool, it's a thing I want to do. I don't think it's necessary, based on the erosion of our classical, you know, if you're not English, you're not white mindset. But I mean, it could be, you know.
So you're pretty much just saying we're just being too highbrow about this.
I think you may be getting caught up in your own map as such.
Yeah, true.
It was just interesting because you said that you don't think that Aboriginal Australians, for instance, would be interested in this.
I think,
so, like,
yeah.
So obviously, if they've got a coercive enough or a strong enough identity matrix that they don't feel like they need to go through the process of constructing one through rigorous and sometimes painstaking, you can just ask Simon about what my mother does, research of one's family history.
Because it's primarily genetic testing. I think genetic testing has a bit of a negative connotation when dealing with Aboriginal Australians. If that makes sense. Like if I have, 20% Aboriginal, but I've been raised as Aboriginal, my community accepts me as Aboriginal. It doesn't matter that it's only 20% genetically. So I think that could be a factor in there. That does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. Well, I mean, potentially as well, this is the difference between like the subaltern and the dominant grouping. So dominant groupings around the world, whether they be, we're talking about Aryan Indians, people who are, who aren't from traditionally oppressed castes. Yet another example of sort of a ethno-religious category, which is pretty fungible over time, but which can seem pretty solid in a day-to-day setting. I suppose they're like bloodline purities have pretty much always been a historic issue for the upper class. I mean, you can look back to in the Jewish context, it's the return of the Babylonian exiles to Judah and their concern with maintaining the bloodline purity of the clans, which actually originally it's one of the causing factors of the separation between the Samaritans and the Jews, because the elites want to conform to bloodline purity.
Yeah, or the Book of Names. I think it's called the Book of Names in the Bible. 300 pages of just son of so and so, son of so and so. So I don't think it's a new phenomenon to desire to fit somewhere, and it could just be that poor people now have the capabilities to. Don't know. Interesting though. Very interesting.
Yeah, well, unfortunately, I think we've kind of led to a natural end of our conversation here. But thank you very much, guys, for joining me once again, and thank you very much to our listeners, and hopefully we'll hear from you next time.
Well, I don't get a say in the matter.
Yeah, neither do I.